Welcome students. Today we discuss on threats of biodiversity part 2. In this second part, the different threats of biodiversity, there should be a scene. Now, what is threats to a biodiversity? Biodiversity is a paramount factor for the survival of living worlds in general and mankind in a particular one. The fewer species of plant and animals we will have on earth, and during the last few decades, due to the summer injury or the damage one, they are a loss from the biodiversity one. Which one are the major causes they gives impact, damage or simply threats to a biodiversity one? So these are habitat loss, poaching of wildlife, man-wildlife conflict and biological invasion ones. So these are the different causes given as to the species are endangered or the extinct. So simply we say that the threats of biodiversity. In this part second of the threats of biodiversity, we just discuss on man-wildlife conflict and invasions of species one or the biological invasions one. What is man-wildlife conflict? Man-wildlife conflict refers to the interaction between wild animal and people and the consequential negative impact on both of them, that is human population growth and the resultant destruction of wildlife habitat for human habitation and economic prosperities create reduction of resources or life to some peoples and also wildlife or the wild animals. So due to the man and the wild animals interaction, the sum of animals they are extinct and given as to the harmfulness one. According to World Wide Fund for Nature, the threats of biodiversity or wildlife conflict is simply described as any interaction between humans and wildlife that results in a negative impact of human social, economic, cultural life on the conservation of wild population or on the environment. It simply we says that wildlife conflict. Since human population expands into the wild animal habitats, natural wildlife territories is a displacement because the human population is a day by day increase and they just comes in the wildlife habitat and disturb them. They also given reduction in the availability of a natural prey or the food sources leads to wild animals seeking alternate their sources of a food one. Alternately, a new resources created by human draws wildlife resulting in a conflict only by the human being one. Now here just we see the some consequences of a man versus wildlife conflict. There are many consequences of man versus wildlife. The major consequences are destruction of wildlife habitat, injury and loss of life of both humans and wildlife, crop damage and the livestock depredation, damage to human property, decrease in wildlife population and reduction in geographic ranges. These are the some consequences occurs in a biodiversity, that means man versus wildlife conflict. Apart from the above, the consequences one, there are some causes it gives to threats to a biodiversity. The factors are climate change, invasions of non-native species, also add to biodiversity losses in some or the others one. Now, the human-wildlife conflict is occur worldwide, but major impact those there will be a biodiversity seen in India. So what about the human-wildlife conflict in India? The growing human population, deforestation, loss of habitat, and decline in their prey species are a few major reasons behind the human-wildlife conflict in India. because the Indian population from 1950 to 2011 they should be a reach each and every day, so they majorly give an impact on wildlife by a human being in India. Natural wildlife territories overlaps with the human existence, and various forms of human wildlife conflict occur with various negative results in the threats occur in between wildlife and the human being one. The some importance conflicts one. Human wildlife conflict has a significant consequences for human health, safety and welfare as well as biodiversity and ecosystem health one. Impact on human can be directed or the indirect way. Human injury and death can result when any wild animal they should be a bite, otherwise directly attack onto the peoples during collisions between animal and the automobiles, trains, planes, boat and ships, other vehicles also they given the importance of conflict one. Then from the wildlife animals, the summer diseases they are transmitted from animals to the human being. Those also given to the conflict, the wildlife as well as the human being one. Conflict with wildlife can causes direct material and economic damage to crop, livestock, game species and also property one. Then now we see the second one greatest threat are nothing but the biological invasions one. So what is invasions? Invasions occur when species are intentionally or accidentally introduced outside of their native or historic range and successfully spread in their new environment. That means any species, though they will be a foreign or simply we say that a exotic one. That means they are introduced from other environment to a new environment or the area. That time such a species they are introduced and they are given to a spreading and successful spread they should occur in a particular new environment called as the invasions one. Biological invasions are a major force of a change affecting many dimensions of a life on earth. Invasions result when a species colonize new geographical region which are isolated from existing populations one, because the new one species they are different from the other existing species one. So both of a species they are differentiated and isolated from each other one. Then the biological invasions are one of the most important ecological disturbance that threaten native biodiversity one. Those there will be a new one species they are introduced in an environment or the area, that time the earlier or the existing species they cause a threaten and they are removed from the native place, that is a biodiversity one. An expected increase in the rate of species extinction will have major effect on the structure and function of ecosystem, those will be occur worldwide. So the major threats given by also those species they are introduced in the environment or also biodiversity. The some invasive species are the invasive species. It is also simply we says that introduced species, alien species or exotic species and any non-native species that significantly modifies or disturb the ecosystem, it colonize one. Such a species may arrive in a new areas through natural migration, but they are often introduced by the activities of other species. Here, the some new introduced species they are migrated or suddenly or they accidentally enter in a new environment or the area. That time they also change ecosystem or the biodiversity one. So the modifications in the environment or the biodiversity is occur by those species they are introduced in the particular area. The some invasive species, those would you known about or they are green crab, killer algae, sea walnut, vein rapa, zebra mussels. These are the some invasive species. One. In this part 2 of the threats of biodiversity, just we see about the habitat loss, poaching of wildlife, man-wildlife conflict, biological invasions. And in between man and wildlife, the interaction is occur, those they are nothing but man-wildlife conflict. Biological invasions change our earth or the life of an individuals as well as also the ecosystem one. The biological invasions are one of the most important ecological disturbances that threaten our native biodiversity one. Then we just see the different questions they are asked on the second part of the threats of biodiversity. So for definition, what is man-wildlife conflict? Then invasions, biological invasions, then also for a short note, man-wildlife conflict, biological invasions, then consequences of a man versus a wildlife conflict, they are asked for the short note one. Then the different multiple choice questions are the first one, dot dot is paramount factor for the survival of living world in a general and mankind in a particular. So options are ecosystem, biodiversity and earth. The answer is B, biodiversity. That is, biodiversity is a paramount factor for the survival of the living world in a general and mankind in a particular one. Then the second MCQs, man-wildlife conflict refers to the dot dot between wild animal and the people's one. Options are first interaction, second differences, similarities. The answer is the interaction one. That is, man-wildlife conflict refers to interaction between wild animal and people's one. And the last MCQs, biological dot dot are one of the most important ecological disturbances that threaten native biodiversity. The options are A, diversity, B, invasions, C, conflict. The answer is invasion. That is, biological invasions are one of the most important ecological disturbances that threaten native biodiversity. So I hope you understand about the two different biological threats